I got up bright and early Tuesday morning to write a piece about the truck driver protests in Canada. Like most Americans, I feel a deep respect for truckers. Everything that enables our comfortable lives comes to us on a truck. Throughout the pandemic, the people who kept us in food and gas and friggin' toilet paper were truck drivers. Nobody ever told these guys to take a nice paid vacation that we could then bill to our grandkids. We all know that Canadians are slow to anger, right? And that Trudeau is something of an entitled douche nozzle. So I assume that these truckers must have a serious problem on their hands. I like to start with a story, so I wrote happily for an hour or so, telling about my Uncle Kevin, who drove a truck cross country in the 60s and 70s, and of his namesake, my brother Kevin, who followed our uncle into the trade and put in his own 3 decades behind the wheel. I was enjoying my writing, reconnecting with these tough men, both of whom died just a few years into retirement. And then, as I always force myself to do, I did some research. The protests were about one central beef. Canadian drivers who crossed back and forth into the States were now required to be vaccinated to get back into Canada. That or face quarantines at the border. As I read deeper, I wondered what our policy was at the border. And here's where things got a little complicated. You see, way back in October, the Department of Homeland Security gave notice that as of January 22nd, nobody would be allowed into the United States without proof of vaccination. What? So while these Canadian truckers were blasting their horns and clogging Ottawa and blocking the Ambassador Bridge and forcing the issue onto the world stage, their basic premise was, how do I say this? Bullshit. Even if Trudeau caved and gave them full vax exemption upon reentry, they couldn't get into the US in the first place. I repeat, a Canadian driver can't get into the States without proof of vax. So how the hell can he return without proof of vax? I kept on researching. Turns out that about 160,000 truckers cross that border regularly. Some are Yanks, some are Canucks. Of that group, about 26,000 are unvaccinated. That's 16% of the 160,000. That means that 84% are vaccinated. Remember, this number includes American truckers, who are only about 60% vaxxed. So Canadian compliance is higher than 84%. Like most of everything we see on the biased news these days, a huge group of people is thought to be represented by a tiny fraction of people. The fraction who are noisy enough to feed a juicy story to the talking heads who need something to yak about. Statista tells us that in Canada, truckers number 324,000. In the States, industry stats show 3.6 million American drivers. Add these numbers together and you're getting close to 4 million truckers in North America, all but a teensy-weensy fraction of whom are out there doing their jobs. I can't find any indication that the Canadian protest includes more than 1,000 truckers, or 0.6% of those who cross that border as a regular part of their work. Maybe I'm just getting old, but I remember when conservatives used to think that people who clogged highways for a useless protest ought to be rounded up into paddy wagons. Is there any doubt at all that we'll soon see a so-called freedom convoy clogging the streets of Washington, D.C.? No, there isn't. Any doubt that right-wing media will cheer? None at all. And will left-wing politicians then fold up and cancel all mandates? You tell me. I drove around LA last week doing a bunch of errands. I guarantee that I saw more truckers in 1 hour than the total number clogging the streets of Canada's capital city. Every one of these guys was fighting traffic and fatigue, and most of all, the unrelenting clock that rules their lives. Every one of them drove with competence and consideration for each other and for those of us in smaller vehicles who are often just rude. A couple of weeks ago, Elon Musk tweeted this: "Canadian truckers rule." He then went on to rant about tyranny. This immigrant to the freest country on earth who has made billions of dollars, most of it in Silicon Valley. A guy who's been allowed to compete with NASA and to bore tunnels under LA. A guy who moved to the most left-wing city in Texas. I mean, have you been to Austin? It's just Santa Monica, the sequel. Musk sounds to me like a guy trying to sell electric vehicles to conservatives. He sounds like a guy who might not hate it if auto parts can't get across the bridge to his competition in Detroit. But he's right. Canadian truckers do rule, just not the ones he's talking about. because the vast majority of them are out there on the road every goddamn day trying to keep the supply chain moving, even while an infinitesimal fraction of their number engages in an orgy of selfishness. And American truckers rule too. The trucking associations in both countries have strongly denounced these protests. Feel free to pause the video and read. Look, the mandates are a response to many months of anti-vax disinformation that flooded Twitter and Facebook. They're a response to the media hucksters who make millions affirming the crowdsourced groupthink of the lowest common denominator. They're a response to unvaccinated people still clogging ICUs when the pandemic should have been over 6 months ago. As Donald Trump has repeatedly said, these vaccinations are safe and 90% effective. Every U.S. senator, with the possible exception of conspiracy buff Rand Paul, has taken them. All of our favorite GOP governors have done the same. And yes, Elon Musk is also fully vaccinated, as is his whole family. Here's what he said last April, before the anti-vaxxers took over and he realized that pandering to them would sell more Teslas. All that any trucker has to do in order to move freely across the border is to do what 90% of Canada's truckers did on their own. Stop by a drugstore, roll up a sleeve, and take a hardly noticeable inoculation. Then grab a quick 8 hours and a diner breakfast and hit the road again. Compare this tiny nod to civic duty with the daily siege faced by truckers for all of the decades that our supply chain has rested on their weary shoulders. My brother Kevin would laugh at this minuscule effort. My uncle Kevin would wink and ask for a fatter needle. Am I for mandates? No, of course not. But when tens of millions of people decided to spend their days online convincing people that COVID was safer than vaccines, mandates were inevitable. And I prefer mandates to the deaths of another few hundreds of thousands of people who are too ignorant to protect themselves from whatever variant is coming next. You know what would be really cool? It would be really cool if conservatives started acting like grown-ups again. Wouldn't that be great? If you agree, you've come to the right place. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, subscribe to our channel and then click the little bell to get notifications.